It was a good day, and so basically there's a lot going on with the expansion right now. This was the week, and you guys are going to see in the next couple days vlogs that kind of show what we've been doing. And so to start with, we got the original, or the first renditions of the expansion drawn by our architects came in. So that, again, that won't be tomorrow's vlog, but it'll be the next day's vlog. And then, you know, we wanted to meet with Steve Bashy, who is an expert in aquatics. You know, he's probably one of the leading guys in the world for filtration and life support when it comes to fish, and also just really understands what fish are about. So, you know, just like I, you know reptiles, you know, and so I can tell, you know, Jay and I were talking about this on the way back, and that's why we were late. We got stuck in traffic. We actually thought we were going to get here. We got a little road work and got stuck in traffic. But so when we're talking on the way back, it's like, I can tell you, like, let's say someone goes like, man, you should have red-eyed skinks in your zoo, you know? I can go like, I love red-eyed skinks. Beautiful animals. Love them to death. One of the coolest. But they hide all the time. They never are out. So I know what to put in the zoo and what not to put in the zoo just through my experience of like working with these animals and other people that work with animals. I also understand, like, you know, how to, you know, the terrarium and the heating and the cooling and all the other things that need to go on. Well, Steve is kind of that to aquatics, right? And me, Steve and myself have been friends literally since he was like 14 years old. I worked at a pet shop way back when I was younger, you know, 16, 17, 18 years old. And I actually managed one of these, the pet shops, and he happened to live right down the street. So much like when I was 14 and 15, I would go into the pet shop that ultimately I ended up working at. You know, he came into my pet shop every single day that I managed, and literally we just hung out. You know, he was a hilarious guy, always got along with him, and he would literally come here every day and for 4 hours in the shop. So basically, back up a second, I worked at this place called the Pet Vendor when I was like, you know, 14, 15, 16, 17. And then when I was 17 and into 18, they opened up a second branch. And that was the branch that Steve used to go to. But it was pretty slow in the beginning because it was a brand new pet shop. People didn't know much about it. And I was literally the only employee. So I was the manager, but also the only employee in this pet shop. So I worked open to close every day and didn't have anyone to help me at all doing anything because it wasn't that busy. You know, we were doing a couple $100s a day in revenue, and that was it. So by the time I ended up leaving, it was becoming more popular and stuff like that. But unfortunately, it did go out of business years later. But Steve used to come in there every day. So there were hours where there was not one other customer in the place, and it would just be me and Steve, and we'd be cracking jokes, we'd be talking about animals, and then all these years later, you know, obviously now I'm in the reptile world, and he's you know, one of the biggest names in the filtration / life support for fish. So he's the one that built the fish spa for us. He built the filtration for the alligators for us. So he's been really intricate in the Reptarium side of it. And so he's like my guy for the aquarium side. Now, he won't build the actual aquariums themselves or enclosures themselves, but he will do all the filtration for me. He will do all of the stuff that needs to get done. So we went over there a couple hours ago, and you know, number one, we BS a lot, and number two, he had lots of great ideas for me when it came to like what we should actually do. And the thing that both Jay and I love about him is that he's just a baller. I mean, like, he's
just like Brian, but like for aquatic stuff.
Yeah,
you know?
and just like, you know, I told Jay I love the thing I loved about him the most today. What he said, the statement he said was that we don't want to put one drop of water in a tank that people aren't going to be blown away by.
I love that.
You know, much like I think of that with the Reptarium. I don't want to waste even one enclosure with something that people aren't going to be blown away by. You know, I want to utilize every inch of space with things that are like,
because
oh
we're
my God,
limited to some degree, right?
Yeah, I mean, you can only do so much. So, so yeah, it's really exciting to have. It's probably the most exciting meeting I've had yet now that we have like drawings I was able to show him, he was able to kind of chime in with his thoughts on what would work, what might not work, so on and so forth. So yeah, it was really good things, man, good things. But you will see that there's been some ups and downs with the last
emotional roller coaster, right?
It's an emotional roller coaster, and by the way, you guys may see the mess is still.
They don't see it, so you could have said nothing, okay, and we would have been fine. But now, there you go for context.
There's a mess on the table. That was on Wednesday's podcast. We did a little clay. As a matter of fact, I can see my guy over here. I'm going to try to pull.
Yeah,
him
you're
over
good. You're good.
My guy over here. It's got some cracks.
Ooh, it cracked up. It got a little dry in there.
I don't know. All right, so my alien here.
Oh, and his
the hat fell off. The hat really did. The actual body itself, actually.
I like that he's got the bald hair.
Yeah. So that guy, that's what I did on Wednesday's podcast. So
check that out.
It actually did pretty well. Actually, it hung on. The hat was a disaster, but I don't really care about the hat. That was an afterthought. So as always, guys, if you have any questions for me, hit the super chats. I'm not really that prepared for anything tonight because we were running around like crazy. The last couple of days have been wild. You know, I mean, like I said, just a lot going on and very busy. And so a lot of times I'll sit down and think about some things that I can chat about on the podcast. This time
I have an idea. If maybe you want to tell, we don't have to.
Yeah, sure.
I always found it very interesting. You said that during the beginning of like the reptile hobby kind of blowing up, that Michigan was kind of a hub.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great thing to talk about. Yeah, people wouldn't really think of it, but first off, obviously, I would say we were, for a good part of the early 2000s, let's say from the late 90s through, probably 2010, 2011, something on that lines. We were probably like the third, maybe fourth largest collection of reptiles in the world, right? Mm-hmm. And back then, much like now, it's like I want this, like, my focus is like I want this amazing experience with reptiles and now maybe aquatics and the zoo type of thing. And my focus is so heavily on that, even though I still love breeding snakes and I love that part of things. Back then, my only focus was to be the biggest collection in the world. It's like I was like, I just want to have, which is really, I'm going to be totally honest with you, it's a terrible thing. I mean, you shouldn't have that mentality, because you should have the mentality of working with your animals the best they possibly can, not having the most animals or more than anyone else. And that's why ultimately when I really kind of made that epiphany, like, hey, wait a second, this isn't what I want to do. And I've told this story before. And like I said, I'm never ashamed of the past. I mean, the past, I own it. I've learned, I've grown. I think if I was the same keeper I was 10 years ago as today, then there'd be a tragedy about that, right? I think that you need to learn and adapt and take on new ideas when it comes to keeping reptiles or keeping any animal for that matter. But nevertheless, it really came to me when I started to realize that, like, there'd be times I go into a room, and we had a 20,000 square foot building full of reptiles, and I'm talking full of reptiles, tens of thousands of snakes, and I hardly did any leopard geckos or any lizards at all at the point, so it was almost all snakes. And there'd be times I would go into a room and had no idea that I had all these one particular type of snakes. Like,
right.
And I go in there, I go, where did these come from? And they're like, oh, we've had them for 6 months.
You're like, what?
And I'm like, wait a second. There's a problem with that. There's a problem if I literally have snakes that I didn't even know I had for 6 months. Right. Like, now I know every snake I have.
Yeah,
every
where
snake.
It is exactly.
Yeah, exactly where it's in.
What
cage,
I
can go. Yeah, I mean, and so that's really what prompted me, amongst other some things too. That's what prompted me to downsize. And then start again, like, to figure out what I wanted to do with the reptile side. But my point is that say I was the third largest collection, they're fourth largest, doesn't matter. The top four were, let's put it this way, the top four, which were Mark Bell, at the time Bill Brandt, the gourmet rodent, now owned by Mike Lehman, Reptiles by Mac, and our collection, right? And all four of those collections were monster collections. The number 5th collection was probably 50% the size of the.
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So there was a huge drop off once you got past those four mega collections. But interestingly enough, 2 of those collections started in Michigan.
It's so weird, right?
So, and literally, like, I lived a mile away from Mark Bell, which is now down in North Naples, and he is right now really the largest collection of reptiles in the world. Most people don't know much about him because he's pretty secretive, but he supplies PetSmart. He also supplies Pet Supplies Plus and a bunch of other big chains. But he also deals with people all over the world. You know, I mean, he's a really good, and he was really my mentor for my younger years because he was probably about 5 years older than me. So when I got into reptiles, he used to, believe it or not, used to bring rodents into the pet shop.
So that's how you met him.
That's how I met him.
I was just gonna say, yeah, paint that picture for me.
And I remember that, like, he used to get pissed off at my owner because, like, I breed reptiles, not rodents, you know. But he bred rodents to feed his reptiles, and when he had extra, he would sell them to the pet shop. But he was always pissed off because my owner, Matt, would never order reptiles from him, but he would order rodents every week.
So
you know,
crazy, yeah.
And so every now and then we buy reptiles from Mark. But I know Mark was always salty. But at the same time, he was like, "Hey, he's just trying to make money." There was really no money to be made in reptiles at the time. So he was just, you know, if he could sell rodents, he was at least paying for his stuff or whatever. Right. And so, but yeah, so there was us 2 in Michigan that were huge collections. And then at the time, there was 4 or 5 other pretty mid-sized collections. There was Dan Malone. There was a guy named Keith Wisner that had a pretty large collection. A guy named Doug that had a pretty large collection. And then there was a few others. So really, the Michigan Herp Society, which was actually based in Lansing, had a number of pretty sizable collections. And then there was the Great Lakes Herp Society, which was really only 60 miles away in my area. And that had a bunch of people that had, you know, hundreds of snakes at the time. And so really Michigan was this mecca of snakes, you know? It
is really crazy because I don't really understand, like, why that is. Right? Because it didn't. You could understand if it was like California, Florida, Texas, Arizona, or something like that. But to be in a cold place where there's not many reptiles.
Yeah.
There's a lot, but there's not many.
Well, there was a guy named Tom Huff that used to run the Toronto reptile breeding facility, and he was another guy that was like a giant back in the day. I mean, I think Tom passed away years ago.
And that's not far from here either.
And again, that was a very northern thing, and that was like back in the day in the 70s and 80s, and even into the 90s when I was coming up. That was like legendary, you know. I mean, it was like ridiculous. So don't get me wrong, there were some monster collections out in California as well. Florida really didn't start picking up. I mean, there were like the importers were in Florida, right? You had Herptofauna, you had you know, Tom Crutchfield's, you had, which actually was Herptofauna, you had Strictly Reptiles at the time, you had Southwest Reptiles, or Florida Southwest Reptiles, which Joe Fossey, which I believe Joe's still doing stuff, but obviously there was the importers down there, and then there were a lot of tortoise guys, like even Wayne Hill and some of these other guys down in Florida were pretty sizable when it came to tortoises. But there wasn't really big reptile collections of snakes and stuff like that in Florida until probably well into the 90s. You know, in the 90s is when it started to pop in Florida, obviously. But yeah, so it was interesting that some of the outliers were in Michigan and cold weather, like Toronto and cold weather states. It didn't really make a lot of sense. But I think that what happened was because the hobby was just starting, obviously guys like Mark Bell, and before him, Mark's mentor was a guy named Tom Lamont that passed away. I had never even met Tom, but Mark bought a lot of his animals from Tom. And so I think that, like, Tom was this guy. And then, like I said, Dan Malone was also a kind of a big guy. He was breeding like Brazilian rainbow boas and emerald tree boas and stuff back in the 80s when no one was doing it.
That shit,
and Dumerils boas and stuff like that. And so I think that like guys like Dan and Tom Lamont kind of encouraged guys like Mark Bell and some of these other guys. And then, of course, Mark and some other guys started encouraging people like me. And at the time, I had a group of friends of maybe, there was like maybe 6 or 7 friends that we used to hang out literally almost every day of the week at night. And we were all young, you know, between, you know, 16 and 20, let's say. Yeah. And we literally almost we go either to a lot of times they all came to my house because my mom was cool about hanging out until wee hours of the morning. Yeah, and we just hang out in the reptile room, you know, just talking reptiles. But sometimes we go to the other guys' places too. And so this group of like 6 or 7 friends, we all were kind of aspiring to be this like next reptile, you know, empire, legend. You know. Yeah, yeah. And of course, which everyone, you know, unfortunately everyone fell away over the years, and I was the last man standing, and still to this day, you know, doing it. But it was an interesting group of people. But we were all inspired by the herp societies. We were inspired by, you know, like I said, Mark Bell and Dan Malone and these other guys, and that's one of the things we've talked about here at the Reptarium.
Damn, son.
Can we rail this in?